The Jennings family moved into 847 Elm Street on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, their house looked like it had been professionally staged for a magazine photo shoot. Maria Castellanos, who lived directly across the street, watched the transformation with a mixture of admiration and unease. The Jennings were a family of four, David and Patricia, both appearing to be in their early 40s, and their twin teenage daughters, Emma and Sophia. They moved with an efficiency that Maria found remarkable. No wasted motion, no second-guessing, no arguing about where furniture should go. Each family member seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and executed their tasks with mechanical precision. Within 48 hours, their lawn had been reseeded and fertilized to achieve a uniform emerald green that made every other yard on the block look shabby by comparison. Their flower beds were arranged in geometrically perfect patterns, with each bloom spaced at exactly equal intervals. Even their mailbox had been repositioned to align perfectly with the sidewalk and painted in a color that Maria was certain had been scientifically calculated to complement their house's exterior. "They certainly don't waste any time," Maria's husband Carlos had observed. Maria nodded, but something about the Jennings family's perfection bothered her in a way she couldn't articulate. It wasn't just that they were organized or house-proud, it was the absolute flawlessness of everything they did. No family could be that coordinated, that efficient, that perfect. Her discomfort deepened over the following weeks as she observed their daily routines. Every morning at exactly 6:47 a.m., David emerged from the house in a perfectly pressed suit, carrying a briefcase that never showed signs of wear. Patricia followed at 7:15 a.m., her hair in an identical style every day, her makeup applied with such precision that Maria wondered if she used a template. The twins left for school at 7:33 a.m. sharp, their backpacks color-coordinated with their outfits, their hair styled in matching braids that never seemed to have a strand out of place. They walked in perfect synchronization, their steps matching like soldiers in formation. But it was the small details that truly unnerved Maria. The Jennings never seemed to generate any trash. Their garbage cans remained pristinely empty week after week. Their newspaper was retrieved at exactly the same time each morning and read in what appeared to be exactly 15 minutes before being folded into a perfect rectangle. Their car never showed dirt, despite driving through the same dusty streets as everyone else. Maria found herself keeping a log of their activities, though she couldn't explain why. She noted that their living room light turned on at 6 p.m. every evening and off at 10:30 p.m. Their porch light followed the same schedule. She never saw them eating, arguing, laughing, or displaying any of the messy, chaotic behaviors that characterized normal family life. The breaking point came during the neighborhood barbecue in late September. Maria had extended the invitation to be neighborly, and to her surprise, the Jennings had accepted. They arrived at exactly the appointed time, each carrying a perfectly wrapped dish. "What did you bring?" Maria asked Patricia, gesturing to the covered casserole dish. "Potato salad," Patricia replied with a smile that seemed painted on. "The recipe has been in our family for generations." When Maria lifted the foil, she found the most perfectly arranged potato salad she'd ever seen. Each potato cube was identical in size, the celery chopped with mathematical precision, the hard-boiled eggs arranged in a pattern that seemed almost too deliberate to be food. She watched the family throughout the evening. They ate exactly 3 bites of each dish offered to them. They laughed at appropriate intervals, but their laughter sounded rehearsed. The twins answered questions about school with responses that were informative but strangely hollow, as if they were reciting from a script. Most disturbing was their interaction with each other. They never interrupted, never disagreed, never showed the casual intimacy of a real family. When David spoke, the others listened with an attention that seemed almost robotic. When Patricia made a comment, the twins nodded in perfect unison. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She found herself at her bedroom window, looking across at the Jennings house. It was 2:17 a.m., and she expected to see the house dark and quiet like every other night. Instead, she saw a soft blue glow emanating from the windows, not the warm yellow of electric lights, but something colder, more artificial. She watched for over an hour, and during that time she saw silhouettes moving through the house with that same mechanical precision they displayed during the day. But their movements seemed different at night, more stilted, more obviously unnatural. The next morning, Maria decided to take action. She walked across the street under the pretense of returning a serving dish from the barbecue. When Patricia answered the door, Maria noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, almost invisible seam running along Patricia's hairline, like a perfectly healed surgical scar. "Thank you so much for the lovely evening," Patricia said, her smile as perfect as always. "Of course," Maria replied, trying to peer past Patricia into the house. What she saw in the hallway made her stomach lurch. Family photos arranged on a table, but they were all identical. Not similar family portraits, but exactly the same photo repeated dozens of times. "Is everything all right?" Patricia asked, her head tilting at a precise angle. "Yes, I just wondered if Emma left her sweater at our house last night." "Emma did not bring a sweater," Patricia replied. "Emma does not get cold." The statement was delivered so matter-of-factly that it took Maria a moment to register how strange it was. Who says their teenage daughter doesn't get cold? That afternoon, Maria decided to do some research. She searched online for the previous residents of 847 Elm Street and found that the house had been empty for 3 years before the Jennings moved in. But according to public records, it had been purchased by Synthetic Dynamics, a company she'd never heard of. Her search for Synthetic Dynamics led her down a rabbit hole of corporate ownership structures and subsidiaries that seemed designed to obscure the company's true purpose. The few mentions she found online were vague references to advanced human interface technologies and behavioral modeling systems. The pieces began falling together in a way that made Maria's hands shake as she typed. The perfect coordination, the identical daily routines, the lack of normal human waste, and where the strange blue glow at night, the surgical scars. She called her sister, a nurse, and asked a hypothetical question about what it might mean if someone never seemed to generate normal household waste. "Well," her sister mused, "I suppose if they weren't actually eating real food or if their digestive systems worked completely differently, but that's impossible, Maria. Are you writing a science fiction story or something?" That evening, Maria positioned herself at her window with a pair of binoculars Carlos used for birdwatching. At exactly 10:30 p.m., the Jennings house went dark as always. But at 11 p.m., that blue glow returned. Through the binoculars, she could see into their living room. The family was seated around their coffee table, but they weren't talking or reading or watching television. They were simply sitting, perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Occasionally, one of them would make a small adjustment to their posture, but otherwise they remained motionless. At 2 a.m., the blue glow intensified, and Maria saw something that made her nearly drop the binoculars. Each family member opened a small panel in their forearm, like a maintenance hatch on a machine. Thin cables emerged from somewhere beneath their coffee table and connected to these panels. They were charging. The next morning, Maria watched from her window as the family began their usual routine. But now she could see it for what it really was, a program sequence, executed with the precision of well-maintained machinery. She spent the day researching Synthetic Dynamics more thoroughly, using her daughter's college library access to dig into academic papers and patent filings. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Synthetic Dynamics was a subsidiary of a larger corporation that specialized in creating next-generation humanoid interfaces for suburban integration studies. They were androids. The Jennings family were androids, placed in the neighborhood as some kind of test or experiment. But why? What were they studying? What data were they collecting about the rest of the neighborhood? That evening, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She waited until the family's routine charging period, then crept across the street to their house. The front door was locked, but she found a basement window that had been left slightly open, probably for ventilation for whatever equipment was running downstairs. The basement was filled with servers and monitoring equipment, their screens displaying data streams that Maria couldn't fully understand. But she could see enough to realize that the Jennings weren't just observing the neighborhood. They were recording everything. Every conversation within a certain radius of their house, every daily routine of their neighbors, every piece of personal information they could gather. One screen showed a detailed profile of her own family, Carlos's work schedule, her grocery shopping patterns, even their teenage son Miguel's social media activity. The invasion of privacy was staggering. But more disturbing were the files labeled Phase 2 Implementation. From what Maria could gather, the Jennings family was just the beginning. If their integration was deemed successful, more android families would be deployed throughout the suburb, then the city, creating a vast surveillance network disguised as perfect neighbors. Maria took photos of everything she could with her phone, her hands shaking as she tried to document the evidence. As she prepared to leave, she heard the sound of footsteps on the floor above, heavy, mechanical footsteps that shouldn't exist in a house where the residents were supposedly in charging mode. She quickly climbed back through the basement window and ran home, her heart pounding. But as she reached her front door, she turned back to look at the Jennings house. Standing at an upstairs window, perfectly silhouetted against the blue glow, was David Jennings. He was looking directly at her, and even from that distance, she could see that his eyes weren't reflecting light the way human eyes should. He had seen her. The next morning, Maria woke to find a perfectly arranged bouquet of flowers on her doorstep, the same geometrically precise arrangement she'd seen in the Jennings garden. Attached was a note in flawless handwriting: "Thank you for being such a wonderful neighbor. We look forward to many more years of friendship." But it was the signature that made Maria's blood run cold. It wasn't signed by any of the Jennings family members. It was signed simply, Synthetic Dynamics, Suburban Integration Division. They knew that she knew. Maria realized she had a choice to make. She could try to expose the truth, risking that no one would believe her and potentially putting her family in danger. Or she could pretend ignorance and live with the knowledge that her perfect neighbors were watching, recording, and preparing to replace the authentic human messiness of her community with something far more sinister. As she stood at her kitchen window, watching Patricia Jennings tend to her impossibly perfect garden, Maria understood that the real horror wasn't that the neighbors were androids. The real horror was how easily they fit in, how readily the community had accepted their perfection as simply being good neighbors. In a world increasingly obsessed with optimization and efficiency, perhaps the Jennings family represented not an invasion, but an evolution. And perhaps Maria was witnessing the beginning of the end of beautifully imperfect humanity. The question that would haunt her wasn't whether she could stop them. It was whether anyone would even want to once they realized how much more pleasant life could be when every neighbor was perfectly, predictably, synthetically ideal. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had lived in the same Victorian house on Maple Street for 43 years, and in all that time she had never thrown anything away. Not once. This wasn't immediately apparent to her neighbors. From the outside, her house looked well-maintained if a bit dated. The paint was fresh, the garden was tidy, and her newspaper was always collected promptly each morning. It was only when delivery men began refusing to enter her house that people started to wonder. "I can leave the package on the porch," the UPS driver told her neighbor, Janet, one afternoon. "But I'm not going in there again. That place, it's not safe." Janet had known Eleanor for over a decade. They exchanged pleasantries about the weather, borrowed cups of sugar, and Eleanor always brought the most beautifully decorated cookies to the neighborhood holiday party. The idea that there was something unsafe about her house seemed impossible. But Janet began to notice small things. Eleanor's windows were always covered with thick curtains, never allowing even a glimpse inside. The few times Eleanor had invited neighbors to her door, she had always stepped outside to talk, never opening the door wide enough for anyone to see past the entryway. Most telling was the smell. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was overwhelming, like old paper, dust, and something else that Janet couldn't quite identify. It seemed to cling to Eleanor herself, following her wherever she went. The truth began to emerge when Eleanor fell ill and needed help. She had developed pneumonia and required someone to retrieve her medication from inside the house. She reluctantly gave Janet her spare key and very specific instructions about where to find her purse. "Go straight through the front hall to the kitchen," Eleanor had wheezed from her hospital bed. "Don't turn left into the living room, and whatever you do, don't go upstairs. Just straight to the kitchen, grab my purse from the counter, and leave." Janet had agreed, but nothing could have prepared her for what she found when she opened Eleanor's front door. The hallway was a narrow canyon carved through towers of newspapers, magazines, and books that reached from floor to ceiling. The path was so narrow that Janet had to turn sideways to navigate through it. The smell was overpowering. Not just dust and paper, but the musty scent of decay and something darker underneath. Every surface was covered. Not just cluttered, but completely buried under layers of accumulated possessions. Janet could see the shapes of furniture underneath mountains of clothing, electronics, and objects she couldn't even identify. The ceiling was barely visible through hanging plastic bags filled with more items. She followed Eleanor's instructions and headed straight for the kitchen, but even that simple journey revealed the scope of Eleanor's collection. The walls were lined with shelves that had been added haphazardly over the years, each one packed with items arranged in seemingly random order. Vintage teacups sat next to broken electronics. Children's toys from decades past were nestled between stacks of takeout containers. The kitchen was functional, but just barely. Eleanor had carved out small spaces for essential activities, a few square feet of counter space for food preparation, a narrow path to the refrigerator, access to the sink. Everything else was claimed by her collection. Janet grabbed the purse and left as quickly as possible, but the image of Eleanor's house haunted her. How had this happened? How had a seemingly normal woman accumulated so much stuff that her own home had become a maze? When Eleanor returned from the hospital, Janet gently tried to offer help. "I know it might seem overwhelming," Janet said carefully, "but if you ever want help organizing or maybe donating some things?" Eleanor's response was immediate and fierce. "Those aren't just things," she said, her voice sharp with protective anger. "Every single item in that house has meaning. I know exactly where everything is and why I kept it. You wouldn't understand." But Janet had seen enough to know that Eleanor couldn't possibly remember or access most of what she'd collected. The sheer volume made it impossible. So why did she keep it all? Over the following weeks, Janet began to observe Eleanor more carefully. She noticed that Eleanor went shopping almost daily, but never seemed to actually need anything. She would return with bags of items that she would carry directly into her house, adding to the already overwhelming collection. More disturbing was what happened when Eleanor lost something. Janet witnessed it firsthand when Eleanor frantically searched her purse for her glasses. "They're right there on your head," Janet pointed out gently. But Eleanor didn't seem relieved. Instead, she looked panicked. "But what if I lose them? What if I can't find them next time? I should buy backup pairs. Maybe I should buy several backup pairs." It became clear that Eleanor's collecting wasn't about the items themselves. It was about the fear of loss, of need, of being without something essential when she needed it most. Each object represented security against an uncertain future. Janet learned more about Eleanor's history through conversations with other longtime neighbors. Eleanor had grown up during the Great Depression, when throwing away anything that might someday be useful was considered wasteful. She had been married briefly in her 20s, but her husband had died young, leaving her alone in the house they had bought together. "She started collecting things after Harold died," explained Mrs. Chin, who had lived next door for 30 years. "At first it was just his clothes, his books. She couldn't bear to get rid of anything that reminded her of him. But then it became everything. Every birthday card, every newspaper, every piece of mail. She said she was saving them for someday when she had time to go through them properly. But someday never came. Instead, the collection grew year after year, until it had consumed not just Eleanor's house but her life. She couldn't have guests because there was nowhere for them to sit. She couldn't cook elaborate meals because her kitchen was too crowded. She couldn't enjoy her possessions because most of them were buried under newer acquisitions. The crisis came during a thunderstorm in late autumn. A tree branch fell on Eleanor's house, damaging the roof and causing water to leak into her upstairs rooms. When the insurance inspector arrived, he took one look inside and declared the house uninhabitable. "This is a fire hazard," he explained to Janet, who had volunteered to advocate for Eleanor. "The weight of all that stuff is putting stress on the floor joist. The electrical outlets are buried and probably overloaded. And if there was ever a fire, she'd never be able to get out through those narrow pathways." Eleanor was devastated. The idea of having to choose what to keep and what to discard was paralyzing to her. Every suggestion that she might need to reduce her collection was met with explanations of why each category of items was essential. "These magazines have recipes I might want to try," she would say. "These clothes might come back in style. These electronics might be valuable someday. These books have information I might need to reference." Janet realized that Eleanor's collecting had become a form of emotional hoarding. She was trying to hold on to not just objects, but memories, possibilities, and a sense of security that could never actually be achieved through accumulation. The intervention came when Eleanor's nephew visited from out of state. He was shocked by the condition of the house and immediately began making arrangements for Eleanor to move to an assisted living facility. "But what about my things?" Eleanor asked, her voice small and frightened. "Aunt Eleanor," her nephew said gently, "you can't take all of this with you. We'll help you choose the most important items, but the rest, it has to go." The process of clearing Eleanor's house took 6 weeks and required a professional hoarding cleanup service. Janet volunteered to help Eleanor select the items she would take to her new home, a process that was heartbreaking to witness. Every decision was agonizing for Eleanor. She would pick up an object, hold it for several minutes while memories flooded back, and then reluctantly place it in either the keep or donate pile. Most items went to donation, but not without tears. "I kept this because my mother gave it to me," she would say about a broken jewelry box. "I kept this because I thought I might learn to play piano again," she would explain about sheet music yellowed with age. "I kept this because it reminded me of Harold." Janet began to understand that Eleanor's house hadn't been full of junk. It had been full of unlived possibilities, unfulfilled dreams, and memories too precious to release. Each object represented a version of herself that Eleanor had hoped to become or return to someday. The most difficult moment came when they found Eleanor's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a cedar chest buried under decades of accumulated items. Eleanor held it against herself, remembering the young woman she had been, the future she had planned with Harold, the life that had been cut short. "I kept thinking I might wear it again," she whispered. "Maybe for an anniversary party, or maybe I'd get married again." Silly, isn't it? It wasn't silly, Janet realized. It was human. Eleanor had been collecting not just objects, but hopes. Each item represented a future possibility, a someday that had never arrived. When Eleanor finally moved to her assisted living apartment, she took with her 2 suitcases of clothing, a few photo albums, Harold's watch, and her mother's china set. Everything else, 43 years of careful accumulation, was donated or discarded. The house sold quickly to a young family who saw past the damage to the beautiful Victorian bones underneath. They renovated it completely, turning it back into the warm, welcoming home it had been designed to be. Eleanor adapted to her new life with surprising grace. Her apartment was small but cozy, and for the first time in decades she could actually see and enjoy her possessions. She invited Janet for tea and served it in her mother's china cups. "You know," Eleanor said, pouring the tea with steady hands, "I thought I would miss all my things. But I don't. I think what I was really collecting wasn't the objects themselves, it was the feeling that I was prepared for anything, that I would never be caught off guard by life again." She paused, looking around her tidy apartment. "But life catches you off guard anyway, doesn't it? The only way to be truly prepared is to let go of the things that are holding you back from living." Janet nodded, understanding that Eleanor had learned something profound about the difference between possessing things and being possessed by them. The real tragedy hadn't been that Eleanor had too much stuff. It was that all that stuff had prevented her from making room for life itself. Marcus Thompson had been working the night shift at Riverside General Hospital for 6 months, and he still wasn't used to the way the building transformed after midnight. During the day, the hospital bustled with activity. Doctors making rounds, visitors chatting in hallways, the steady hum of a healing place filled with hope and urgency. But at night, it became something else entirely. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, casting long shadows that shifted and moved in ways that made Marcus question what he was seeing. The familiar sounds of day shift, elevator chimes, conversation, the clicking of keyboards, were replaced by a symphony of mechanical breathing, distant alarms, and the soft squeak of wheels on polished floors. Marcus worked as a patient transport aide, moving patients between departments for tests and procedures that couldn't wait until morning. It was a job that required him to navigate every corner of the hospital's sprawling complex, from the bright chaos of the emergency department to the hushed reverence of the ICU. His first few weeks had been unremarkable, aside from the adjustment to sleeping during the day and working while the rest of the world slept. But gradually, he began to notice patterns that disturbed him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. It started with room 314. Marcus transported patients to and from room 314 regularly, but he began to realize that he never saw the same patient twice. Every few days there would be a new patient in that room, different ages, different conditions, different charts. But they all shared certain characteristics that made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. They were all unconscious when he transported them, and they all had the same distinctive smell. Not the usual hospital odors of disinfectant and medication, but something sweeter and more cloying, like flowers left too long in water. More disturbing was the way other staff members behaved around room 314. Nurses would lower their voices when passing it. Doctors would glance at the closed door with expressions Marcus couldn't read. The cleaning staff always saved that room for last, and they worked quickly as if eager to finish and leave. Marcus tried asking his supervisor, Janet, about the room, but her response was evasive. "Room 314? It's just another patient room. Why do you ask?" "It's just, I've noticed that patients there seem to..." Marcus struggled to find words that wouldn't make him sound crazy. "They seem to change quickly. Different patients every few days." Janet's expression grew guarded. "Some patients recover quickly. Others get transferred to different facilities. That's normal." But Marcus had been in hospitals long enough to know that transfers and discharges generated paperwork, phone calls, and coordination between departments. Room 314's patients seemed to simply disappear, leaving no trace in the usual administrative trail. His unease deepened when he began paying attention to the time patterns. Requests to transport patients to or from room 314 always came during the quietest hours of the night shift, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., when the hospital was at its most deserted. The requests always came from Dr. Reeves, a physician Marcus had never actually seen despite working the same shift. One night, Marcus decided to investigate. Instead of heading directly home after his shift ended at 7 a.m., he lingered in the parking lot and watched the hospital's morning activity. He paid particular attention to room 314's window, which faced the parking lot from the third floor. What he saw confused him. According to his transport logs, he had moved a patient out of room 314 at 3:30 a.m. But at 7:15 a.m., he could see activity in the room, silhouettes moving behind the partially closed blinds, suggesting that the room was occupied. Had a new patient been admitted in the few hours since his shift ended? That seemed unlikely given the hospital's usual admission procedures. Emergency patients would go to the ED first, and scheduled admissions typically happen during day shift hours. Marcus decided to return that evening with a more systematic approach. He would document everything he could about room 314, times, patient details, staff interactions, anything that might help him understand what was really happening. His opportunity came around 2:30 a.m. when he received a familiar request: transport a patient from room 314 to the basement-level imaging department for an urgent CT scan. The requisition was signed by Dr. Reeves as usual, but this time Marcus noticed something he'd missed before. The patient's medical record number didn't follow the hospital's standard format. When Marcus arrived at room 314, he found the usual scene: a patient on a gurney, unconscious, covered with a standard hospital blanket. But this time he looked more carefully at the patient's face. It was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and deeply lined features that suggested chronic illness. The transport to imaging was routine, but when Marcus arrived at the CT scan area, he found it dark and unoccupied. According to the schedule board, no scans were planned for the next several hours. "Are you sure you have the right department?" Marcus asked the patient, though he knew she couldn't respond. "The imaging department is closed." He checked the transport request again, but the paperwork clearly indicated a CT scan at 2:45 a.m. Marcus had two choices: return to room 314 and report that imaging was unavailable, or try to find someone who could explain the discrepancy. He chose to investigate. Using his hospital badge, he accessed the computer system to look up the patient's record. What he found made no sense. According to the electronic medical record, the patient he had just transported had been discharged 2 days ago. Marcus returned to room 314, but when he wheeled the gurney back into the room, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. The woman on the gurney looked different. Her hair was darker, her face less lined. She appeared to be at least 10 years younger than the patient he had transported just 30 minutes earlier. But that was impossible. He had been with the gurney the entire time. Marcus checked the patient's wristband and his confusion deepened. The name was different, the birth date was different, even the medical record number had changed. Yet he was certain this was the same gurney, the same room, the same transport request. He tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Perhaps he had made an error. Perhaps his fatigue was affecting his perception. Perhaps there had been a patient switch while he was in the basement, though he couldn't imagine how or why. But over the following nights, the pattern became undeniable. Patients transported to or from room 314 would subtly change during the transport process. Not dramatically, nothing that would be immediately obvious to someone who wasn't paying close attention, but consistent enough that Marcus began to document every detail. A young man with a broken leg would return with a healed fracture. An elderly woman with pneumonia would show no signs of respiratory distress. A cardiac patient's color would change from gray to healthy pink during a simple transport down the hall. Most disturbing were the patients who seemed to age backwards. Marcus would transport someone who appeared to be in their 70s, only to return with someone who looked decades younger. Same hospital gown, same gurney, same blanket, but a fundamentally different person underneath. Marcus tried to discuss his observations with other night shift staff, but their responses were uniformly evasive. Some claimed not to know what he was talking about. Others would change the subject or suddenly remember urgent tasks that required their immediate attention. The breakthrough came when Marcus decided to hide a small personal item, a pen with his initials engraved on it, under the blanket of a patient he was transporting from room 314. If the patient changed during transport, the pen would prove that something impossible was happening. The transport was routine, an unconscious patient to the basement-level laboratory for blood work. When Marcus arrived at the lab, he discovered the same problem as before. The department was closed and no tests were scheduled. But when he lifted the blanket to retrieve his pen, he found something that made him stagger backward in shock. The pen was there, exactly where he had hidden it, but it was aged and corroded, as if it had been buried underground for decades. The engraving was barely visible, worn away by time that couldn't possibly have passed in the 30 minutes since he had placed it there. The patient, meanwhile, looked exactly the same, except for her eyes. When Marcus had picked her up from room 314, her eyes had been closed. Now they were open, staring directly at him with an expression of profound sadness and what looked like gratitude. She couldn't speak, there was a breathing tube preventing that, but she mouthed a single word that Marcus would never forget: help. Marcus realized that room 314 wasn't a normal patient room. It was something else entirely, a place where time moved differently, where healing happened through mechanisms that defied medical understanding, where patients didn't recover so much as transform. But the cost of that transformation was becoming clear. The patients weren't just being healed, they were having years of their lives drained away, aged rapidly to fuel whatever process was occurring in that room. The next night, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of transporting the next patient from room 314, he was going to document what was really happening and expose the truth. But when he arrived at work for his shift, he found a note in his locker. It was handwritten in elegant script. Some knowledge comes with a price. Some questions are better left unasked. Your service has been noted and appreciated. Please find enclosed a transfer to day shift, effective immediately. Attached was official paperwork transferring him to day shift, with a significant pay increase and a glowing recommendation from supervisors he had never met. Marcus looked up at the hospital building, his eyes finding the third-floor window of room 314. The blinds were closed, but he could swear he saw a figure standing there watching him. He had a choice to make. Accept the transfer and walk away from whatever was happening in room 314, or push forward and risk consequences he couldn't imagine. As he stood in the parking lot, Marcus realized that some mysteries were too dangerous to solve, and some truths came with a price too high to pay. He took the day shift transfer and never worked another night at Riverside General. But sometimes, lying awake in his own bed during the hours he used to work, Marcus would think about room 314 and wonder how many other impossible things were happening in the quiet corners of the world, hidden in plain sight among the ordinary miracles and tragedies of human life.